Okay, so now let's turn to sign language. So far we've mostly talked about spoken languages, and in spoken language, the articulator, so the organ that externalizes the language, is obviously the mouth and the vocal tract. But in sign language, the articulator is the hands. And so now I want to ask the question of how that affects the neurobiology of language. And so before we get started, I just want to clarify four important things about sign language. And these are things that there are lots of misconceptions about. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page as we get started. First, there is no one sign language. There are hundreds of sign languages in the world. They vary from place to place, just like spoken languages. Also, if two countries or regions share a spoken language, that does not mean they share a sign language. So, for example, British Sign Language and American Sign Language are not mutually intelligible, even though people in the US and in the UK usually can understand each other if they're speaking varieties of English. Second, the grammar of a sign language does not mirror or depend on the grammar of the surrounding spoken language. It does not follow the surrounding spoken language. Third, sign languages are fully fledged linguistic systems with phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics, so distinct representational levels, just like in spoken languages. Four, signing is not a form of gesturing. Of course, signers do also gesture, that's natural. So just like in spoken language, we often gesture at the same time with our hands. But rather than gesturing with their hands, signers gesture with their face or with other parts of their body. But sign language combines with gesture just like spoken language does. Okay, so let's then move on to our main questions. So there's, of course, lots to talk about when it comes to sign language. So this will just be some brief remarks. And so I want to focus on the question, why has language set up shop where it has in the brain? And so in this course, we've learned that the temporal lobe is really important for language. So a lot of the temporal cortex is engaged when we use language, also parts of the frontal cortex, of course. And so this picture kind of raises the question of whether the neurobiology of spoken language localizes in this way because it's somehow convenient. It's somehow conveniently organized around the auditory cortex. And so the question kind of is also, has language set up shop in locations that are convenient for the auditory modality, which is what we use in spoken language? If that's so, if that is correct, then sign languages might localize differently. We would get some relevant data for this question from sign language. So first I want to ask a broader question, and that is whether sign language is as left lateral as spoken language. And then we'll turn to a finer grained level. So then we'll also ask, to what extent are the neural bases of signed and spoken languages similar in the details? So when we talk about more specific computations, including the timing of those computations. Okay, so for spoken language, we of course have very classic evidence from aphasia for its left laterality. So we know that left hemisphere damage is usually much more detrimental to language than right hemisphere damage. But interestingly, for sign language, the right hemisphere is considered to contribute importantly to spatial cognition. And sign language, of course, is articulated in space. You use space to sign. And so that has given rise to the question and hypothesis of whether sign language may be more right lateral than spoken language. So I want to look at a classic paper by David Carina and colleagues where they report a case study. And this touches on many of the topics that then continue to be studied for many years after. So this is a report about the case WL. So WL is a 76-year-old congenitally deaf right-handed male who, as a result of stroke, acquired a large frontotemporal lesion in the left hemisphere. And his Broca's area was affected and subsequent white matter tracts as well, including the arcuate fasciculus. But his more posterior temporal cortex, so more like Wernicke's area, was not damaged. This is a picture of WL's damage, so you can clearly see the Broca's area damage here and the arcuate fasciculus, the white matter tract damage. Okay, so we first want to ask whether WL's spatial cognition is intact. If it's not intact, then his sign problems might be caused by just a more general spatial cognition problem. So we want to kind of establish that first. So what does his spatial cognition look like? These are some classic spatial cognition tests. For example, you would be given a line with an orientation, and then you have to match that orientation to a choice in an array. WL does perfectly on that test. And then we have a couple different tasks where you draw to match a model. So here are some models. These are WL's drawings, reproductions. They're pretty perfect. As a comparison point, here we have a right hemisphere damaged individual's reproductions of these drawings. And as you can see, they're clearly much worse. Similarly, here we have the models. WL's reproductions are perfect. Right hemisphere damaged individuals' reproductions far from perfect. So yes, his non-linguistic spatial cognition is intact, and so we won't be interpreting his assigning problems in terms of a more general spatial cognition problem. We can rule that hypothesis out as an explanation of his signing problems. So he does have problems signing, and in particular, his mistakes are of a couple different types. The first one is so-called paraphasias. And these are phonological mistakes, so mispronunciations. And so here is what they look like. So for example, here you see the sign for screwdriver. And the mistake that WL would make is to use the incorrect hand shape. And so now, just like spoken words, signs can be decomposed into kind of smaller features, and hand shape is one of those smaller features. Others might be the location of the sign, where you the location with respect to the body where you sign it, or the type of motion, for example. So he has a very specific type of mistake that he makes, and that has to do with the hand shape feature. Some more examples. Here we have the sign for fine. Again, he uses the wrong hand shape. Sign for white. He uses the incorrect hand shape sequence, and so forth. The second type of mistake that WL is doing is to substitute gestures for signs. So remember on the first slide, I said that sign languages are not systems of gesturing. Gesture and sign are distinct, and this really shows that very clearly. So for the sign of flower, he would actually kind of gesture flower, but that's not the sign for flower. So he'll just kind of use the motion for smelling or something like that. Similarly, for the sign fall, which is a specific sign, he will gesture falling. ball, that's the sign for ball, he will gesture bouncing to indicate ball. Airplane, sign like this, he will gesture flying to try to convey that meaning. So WL's left lateral damage caused a language impairment, but no impairment in spatial cognition or gesturing. We can look at his performance more broadly on a aphasia battery of tests. So this is a battery of diagnostic tests for aphasia that are designed for sign language. And so when we have kind of the normal performance, so this is elderly deaf controls, not they're not brain damaged in any way. The normal pattern is like the straight line, and then there's this angle at the end. So the angle comes from the sign finding test. Normal is in the middle, and then here on the left, fluent without information. So that's kind of a Wernicke's aphasia pattern. And then on the right side, we have exclusively content signs. So that's the pattern where you have kind of an agrammatic production, Broca's aphasia like. WL's performance is clearly not normal. So he has lots of deviations from the typical pattern. So that's, of course, just one person. It's a case study. I just want to quickly show you similar performance on this battery of tests from a group of patients. So this is a study by Greg Hickok and colleagues a little bit later, a paper published a little bit later. So here again, the leftmost column, that's normal performance. So we get that straight line and then the angle. Then we have right hemisphere damaged deaf individuals, and pretty much we get that same pattern. Okay, so right hemisphere damage is not affecting your performance on these tests. But clearly here on the in the rightmost column, we have the left hemisphere damaged individuals. So that's 10 individuals compared to the 7 right hemisphere damaged individuals. And it's just, it's a mess, right? So clearly left hemisphere damage seems to affect your signing. Okay, so here we see various types of evidence that in fact sign language does seem to be left lateral, just like spoken language, predominantly. Okay, so let's then get to a more detailed level. So we've learned that there's a fundamental distinction in language between retrieval processes and combinatory processes. So lexical access and composition. We access the elements from the basic building blocks of language from long-term memory, and then we have processes that enable us to combine them together into larger expressions. So now we've learned that both of these processes seem to engage the left temporal lobe. So the left temporal lobe seems to be important both for lexical access and for composition. And so we can then ask the question of whether left temporal damage specifically impairs sign access and composition, similarly to spoken language. And now this was exactly that question about like, well, auditory cortex is also in temporal cortex. Is that why these linguistic functions kind of like to localize close to it? Okay, so that's exactly the question that was addressed in this study, again, by Greg Hickok and colleagues. And so here, they studied left hemisphere damaged deaf signers, so 11 of them, and right hemisphere damaged deaf signers, 8 of them. And further, these patients were divided into ones whose temporal lobe was spared versus ones whose temporal lobe was involved in the damage. Okay, so that's our kind of 2x2 grid. And we're going to be looking at 3 tasks. So one of them is kind of a simple lexical access level task where you're matching single signs to pictures. So it's a comprehension task. Then we have a basic combinatory task. So you get a very simple command and then you have to execute that. So just kind of one clause, one step. So again, comprehension. And then finally, complex commands. So you would be asked to touch all the circles except the yellow circle, for example. Okay, so simple lexical access, simple combinatorics, and then slightly more complex combinatorics. So what happens? So first we have the lexical access task. You see clearly that the right hemisphere damaged individuals did perfectly on it. The right hemisphere damage is not affecting this task. The left hemisphere damaged individuals whose temporal lobe was fine are also doing perfectly. But the individuals whose left temporal lobe was involved in the damage, they're the ones who are doing a little bit worse. They're not doing terrible though. I mean, this is still like 80% correct. What about when we add a little bit more complexity to the task? So you have to do lexical access and composition. Now the pattern looks a little bit different. So here again, right hemisphere damaged individuals are great. Nothing is impaired. But now the left hemisphere individuals whose temporal lobe is damaged, they're doing quite a bit worse. But the ones whose temporal lobe is fine, they're still almost perfect. What about the most complex task? Here, everyone is now suffering a bit. And that makes sense because this is now quite a complex task. And remember, these are individuals who have brain damage. So even the right hemisphere group is a little bit lower. And then all the left hemisphere damaged individuals are, quite impaired, but especially the ones whose left temporal cortex was involved in the damage. Okay, so here we can see evidence that lexical access and combinatory processing also localize in left temporal cortex in signers as well. Can we make this even more detailed? So now I want you to remember this version of a picture naming task where you're presented with a colored object. The color happens to be white here, but anyway, a colored object, and your task is to name that object as a phrase like white lamp. So that's the task, a variant of a basic picture naming task. So now with a technique like MEG, magnetoencephalography, we can measure the processes millisecond by millisecond that take place from the onset of the picture to the onset of the articulation. So now I'm talking about it in terms of spoken language. So here, this would be something like 700 milliseconds of activity, which is a lot of activity when it comes to language planning. Lots of computational sub-steps can be included there. So now the really cool aspect of this task is that it totally straightforwardly extends to other languages. So you can keep the physical stimulus totally constant. So exactly what your perceptual systems get can stay completely constant, and you can change the language, including changing it to a language that uses a different articulator, like sign language. So that's a nice opportunity to ask whether the computations that happen as you're planning this expression, many of them could be similar because it's really kind of a relatively late stage decision when you're kind of at the articulatory stage. So potentially we could find a lot of similarity until the processing routes diverge. And so that's English, that's American Sign Language, ASL. And in this paper that my group published a couple of years ago, this is exactly what we set out to investigate. We want to see, is there similarity between the processes that kind of compose a simple phrase in English versus in American Sign Language? And an important design feature of this experiment was that we had a non-combinatory control condition that actually also involved articulating an adjective and noun. And the way we created that, so of course also in ASL, the way we created that was to have people, have the subjects name the background color and the object shape during so-called list blocks. So here in the combinatory task, the phrase task, you're just like very naturally naming white lamp, red cup, and so forth. And then during the list blocks, you're naming the background color and the object shape. And so there we were interested in seeing, would we replicate our usual composition effects for the phrase versus list contrast when really the categories kind of stay very constant, and then how that would relate to what we see for sign language. And here's what we learned. So the blue data are ASL, the orange data are English, and the darker bars are the phrase conditions, and the lighter ones are the list conditions. And so now should look at English first. So in English, we replicated our usual findings in the left anterior temporal lobe and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So here the phrases elicited more activity than the lists. And the effects happen in two stages. So remember, we're measuring from the onset of the picture to the onset of articulation, both in the left anterior temporal cortex. There was an earlier time window during which we saw separation, and then also a later time window. And similarly for the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And what I'm showing you here is two time periods during which there was a main effect of composition, so phrase versus list, no interaction with language. So two time windows during the planning stages during which sign language and spoken language, specifically ASL and English, seem to be doing the same thing, or at least a similar thing. So this just shows you that we can also find similarity at this kind of finer grain. Of course, there are differences as well, but I'm focusing here on the possible similarities. So there are similarities in the neural processing of sign and speech, even at this more fine-grained level, including the time courses of specific processes in specific parts of the temporal cortex. So here we were in the very anterior part of the temporal cortex. So this main question that I set out to ask is, of course, a big one and a really complicated one, but these kinds of data suggest that it is unlikely that the clustering of various linguistic functions in the left temporal cortex is because of the proximity to auditory cortex. We seem to be able to find similar results also for sign language. And so next we are going to move to the relationship between language and other cognitive abilities, specifically as evidenced by developmental disorders like Williams syndrome and specific language impairment. I'll see you then.